Very good. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on our once every 3-week webinar where we do on topics of importance to the people we serve at Friendship Place, the community in which we reside, friends of Friendship Place, and really just it's a great opportunity to learn more about the work we do and also hear from the community about what the impact that what work we do has on the community at large. So we are here today to talk about how do we recognize when someone is in crisis, when we come across them on the street, and what can we do, what's the most kind way that we can be of service to them. We have a wonderful panel here today who'll tell a little more about themselves. We have Liza, Poris, and Antwan Gillis from our Welcome Center and Street Outreach team. We have Chandra Dawson here from our various Neighbors First programs and Valley Place programs. We have Officer Wright here from District 2. And so it should be a robust conversation. As always, please put your questions in the chat and we will be able to get to them and answer them. First, however, I'm going to toss to Jean-Michel to tell us a little more about what we're here for today. Hello, Jean-Michel.
Well, thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being online with us this afternoon. This webinar is part of a series of webinars where we are hoping to support the community around the issues involving voucher holders in Upper Northwest. As a historical homeless services organization in the ward, Friendship Place feels that it has a responsibility to help community members become more knowledgeable about the system and some of the solutions that are available to neighbors and friends. Today, we're going to look at how to respond to a crisis and hopefully extend kindness and try to be effective to help people on the streets. I want to thank our panel members, the folks from Friendship Place. Thank you for being with us, and Officer Wright of NPD. I'm just going to turn this over to Antwan Gillis, who is our Assistant Director at the Welcome Center and is in charge of our outreach services. So over to you, Antwan.
Thank you. How you guys doing? My name is Antwan Gillis, Assistant Director at the Welcome Center, Homeless Services. We provide services, street outreach to our vulnerable individuals in the Washington, D.C. area. In Ward 3, in the Tentley Town area, we provide adult outreach to the most vulnerable single individuals, where we go out and engage them to build rapport and to, bridge them to the different services throughout the city. With one of them being trying to help them, get housing and get off the streets, because we do know that homelessness is an experience. So we want to make that experience brief. A part of that is, building those relationships, doing those assessments and things like that, getting people in the homeless service system in order for them to get those vouchers or the permanent supportive housing that they may need. For those who don't know, like some of the programs that we bridge to is the Rapid Rehousing Program, the Permanent Supportive Housing Program, and also youth services for transitional age youth, 18 to 24. I know we wanted to talk a little bit about crisis. Crisis can look ways and we see folks. Some of the crisis situations could consist of folks like having some mental health instability. It could be walking in the street, what we would consider like planning traffic, or putting themselves or others in danger. So what we would do in that case is try to speak to the individual to see if we can remove them, not physically move them, but ask them to step out the street, or that, and see if they are willing to just do that. But if not, we would probably reach out to MPD and ask for a crisis intervention officer. which is a little bit different from just calling a normal officer. The crisis intervention officer is supposed to be a little bit more, skilled in mental health and kind of know the community and how to work with the community. We do know folks who are in crisis sometimes don't work well with officers. So we can also call, 911, ambulance as well if it's an emergency. I don't want to go too far into the logistics of how that happens. I can answer some questions when those questions come around, but for the most part, if someone is experiencing crisis inside the house, we do have case managers that provide services to the individual. It should be 2 to 3 times a week, face to face, and also, making telephone calls and things like that to them, assuring that they're living good. They have life skills, because we're talking about folks who have been experiencing homelessness for a long time. So we have to help them to live again on their own. We have to give them those type of skills. And if someone is experiencing a crisis in their home, which could be like, if a case manager shows up and they blocking the door, they hoarding a lot of things, stuff like that, then the case manager will call DBH crisis hotline, mobile crisis, and mobile crisis will come and assess the individual in the house. So it's 2 different things. When you're on the street, we may want to reach out to MPD, a CIO officer. And if someone is in housing, we want to call mobile crisis, which is Department of Behavioral Health. So I'll leave it there, pass it to Liza. And if you guys have any questions, specific questions, I can answer those for you.
I think you've said a lot of what we do when we see people out on the street. Just to add to what you were saying about that CRT, that community response team from DBH, at times too, when you're assessing a situation of somebody you might encounter outside, and it seems like a crisis, but it's not an immediate emergency where that individual isn't at harm or others aren't at harm, that community response team can be an important resource to contact as well. And that number is available for all of us to call. I can share it here out loud, and maybe we can put it in the chat as well. That number is 202-673-6495. And another important thing that team does, beyond just sort of the type of crisis that you might see that Antwan explained, like that an individual maybe walking out into traffic or maybe without shoes, there's also scenarios where somebody's health is at risk if they're outside in freezing temperatures, and you see somebody outside and you might not be able to engage with them, but it seems like a potential crisis situation if they were to stay out there for a long time, or in the summertime, if it's now that it's getting really hot outside. That team, that number that I shared, that crisis response team, can visit those individuals that you might be concerned about, that might be an escalating crisis, and do a wellness check. So that's an important number to have. And then also a similar scenario, if you see somebody outside who you think is unhoused and you think that they might be ending up in freezing temperatures over the night, and you think that can escalate to a crisis, we also have that shelter hotline here in DC that can do wellness checks to visit somebody who's living outside and experiencing freezing temperatures or hot temperatures, to bring them blankets and bring them something to keep them warm, or also transport them to the shelter. And so that's an important phone number to have, and something that's been helpful for us in outreach as well. And that phone number is 202-399-7093. And of course, if you're here in our neighborhood, and where we are at the Welcome Center on Wisconsin Avenue in Tenleytown, of course, the outreach team is in this area, and we're always looking to build relationships to maybe be that person in between somebody and a crisis. So referring them to us here at Friendship Place so that we can build that rapport and be another friendly face between them and an emergency responder, or maybe somebody that can prevent them from falling into crisis. We're here, open up the Welcome Center Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, 9 to 12, 1 to 4, and they can drop in. On Monday, in the afternoon, we have Unity Healthcare here. And so if you think somebody is experiencing a health emergency, but it's not something that requires 911 right away, that they can drop in here and see a doctor on Mondays. And then on Thursdays, we have a psychiatrist here as well, and they can drop in and visit our psychiatrist. So that's something that's important for us to be able to build those relationships with people who are outside. And so oftentimes having that friendly face can be something that can really prevent somebody from falling deeper into crisis.
Thank you.
And I will pass it on to Chandra, I believe.
No, I think we're going to go Officer Wright first.
Oh, sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. So Officer Wright, what do you see from your point of view in terms of community response? What sort of crises do you come across? What sort of calls do you get? And what is your opinion is the best way for neighbors to address that?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Officer Wright. I work here in the 2nd District here in Washington, D.C. And I'm part of the 2nd District Homeless Outreach. And I also will work with our community outreach team as well. I'm also a CIO officer, as Mr. Antwan did a great job of discussing. And we receive extra training in regards to dealing with folks that may or may not be experiencing mental crisis. Some of the key things that we'll do when we show up is first observe the individual, note their behavior, what's going on, offer a non-judgmental listening ear, which allows folks to be comfortable and get things that they may have off their chest, and to hear what's going on with them and to actually give them that ear to listen. Respect the privacy, obviously. Not going to be attending community meetings and discussing what a mental health consumer may have shared with us or something along those lines, while still acknowledging the community's needs. So kind of balancing the respect and dignity and privacy of those that we're serving, as well as the concerns of the community. We'll also serve as a link towards to intervention. We'll have the ability, sometimes folks are not in a place to call for help or call their caseworker. A lot of people that we interact with, DC does a really good job of putting caseworkers and crisis response teams, or there's different providers that the city works with, and calling that mobile crisis phone number that Ms. Liza, I believe, put out. That number specifically is for the northwest portion of the city. So that's the 100% correct number. And a lot of times we'll have the ability to call them and chat with the folks and let them know, if we provide the name and the date of birth of the person that we're dealing with. A lot of times they have already dealt with them. And that's really helpful because it puts us in a position to learn from the real professionals with this, as to what conditions the person has, if they do have mental health conditions, what were positive outcomes in the past, as well as potentially getting that person's actual case manager out there in real time, which is super helpful. So for us, a lot of times people, when they see folks experiencing mental health crisis, they'll just call 911, and we will come out as a police department. We will assess if we are needed, and to what degree. Sometimes that's calling mobile crisis on behalf of the person. Sometimes that is just chatting and like Mr. Antwan said, getting that person out of the street, for hypothetical, and just chatting with them about rectifying the situation. Sometimes it's that person will want to go for psych evaluation, which time we'll provide them transport, which would be voluntary. We also do involuntary transport as well if someone is a danger to themselves or others. And as Ms. Liza said, danger to self is not necessarily what we would consider violence. It could be a neglect of self-care, the inability to safely exist in sub-freezing temperatures with no shoes, and not seeing that as a problem. So the difference, that would be the neglect of self-care versus the inability to provide one's self-care. If the person has an inability, we have resources throughout the city that we can call for blankets, shoes, clothing, things of that nature. That's not going to get that person involuntarily committed. So that's not something people have to worry about. The involuntary commitment comes when the person doesn't realize what they're doing is a detriment to themselves or others. We also have a pre-arrest diversion program that we will utilize. It's for low-level offenses, maybe a theft or a shoplifting or a urinating in public, something along those lines, where if the individual we're dealing with is cooperative, we'll get their information and we'll provide that person's information to Department of Behavioral Health, who will get them linked up with advocates and caseworkers and resources. And that's in lieu of arrest. So if the person is receptive to that, that's a great program that we have, because then we don't clog up our system when we could be focusing on more serious crime. And it also provides that person the ability to get some help, which is really what they need. And then let's see. Yeah, I would just say if there's a concern, just, give 911 a call and you'll get an officer that will come out there. And especially if it's mental health, the dispatcher, those calls are flagged and a dispatcher will request specifically for a crisis intervention officer to respond. And again, these officers, as Mr. Antwan stated, are specially trained, and we will have continuing education as well. So it's not just like a one and done type class. And it's a volunteer training. So people aren't getting drafted or told they're going to get this training. They're actually volunteering for it. So you get someone who wants to be there. So look forward to the questions. And again, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We're going to go to Chandra now for your insights, from your social work background.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. I think my panelists have done a phenomenal job of really just outlining the resources here in the city, some of how crisis can manifest. I think I would first, let me begin. I am Chandra Dawson. I serve as the Chief Permanent Housing Officer here in Friendship Place. And so under my cluster, we have Neighbors First Individuals and Families, as well as La Casa and Valley Place. One of the things that I think is critical if we're going to have a dialogue around crisis intervention for those experiencing mental health crises, what is a crisis? What does that look like? And a crisis looks very different. That can be very individualized. And that the factors that contribute to that presentation, one, the mental health diagnosis, be it if the person is actually diagnosed or not. Other piece of co-occurring issues, mental health, in addition to as it intersects with substance abuse, is going to look very different, as well as physical and environmental issues. If I have a mental health diagnosis and I have not had any proper nutrition, it's going to look different. Crisis and how it presents looks very different. That is something difficult for any of us to assess. And I say that as a licensed social worker with plus 20 years of experience. That is not something you can readily identify. Depending upon the crisis determines how you intervene. I would say for us, in the sense of a community dialogue, one of the things you want to factor in as a bystander, I really think more of it is around just the bystander intervention. Now, there are some things definitely we want that's universal. We don't corner individuals. We don't have the autonomy or agency, especially as just general community citizens, that we get to touch someone. We are cautious. I would tell anyone, let me normalize, first of all, especially for those who are untrained. You see someone, depending on the presentation of the crisis, that can be scary. That can provoke a whole lot of emotions, one of which is fearful. I'll add to the normalcy of the fear, even with years of experience. There are moments that I'm in spaces as it relates to behavioral health crises that is scary to me. Let's normalize the fear. What we have to be cognizant of is how we respond to our fear. Because what I will add to this conversation is that most individuals that are experiencing crises, believe it or not, you are frightening to them. They more often than not deem you threatening based on your body language, what you are saying, your eye contact, your close proximity. And so one of the things that I think is just consistent is, as a bystander, if you see someone in a community experiencing crisis, and again, this varies on presentation, there are some fundamental things we don't do in addition. So If you're in the community and there are others around, advocate and partner with others in the community. Talk to them versus engaging the individual that's in crisis. That it may be best suited to talk to your neighbor or the person who's standing on the street with you, acknowledging this person that looks like they may be presenting in a crisis. Maybe we should give this individual space. Again, you can engage the community supports and resources, but I think as a bystander, the best approach, because it's so differential, because honestly, as the officer outlined, this requires specialized training. I would not deputize any of us to go assess, intervene. Again, that is very challenging. Work on stabilizing the community or the environment around the individual. And so that's the space. If you can get in front of not get in front of the cars, let me correct that. But if you're ever able to deflect or redirect that traffic using the example I believe Antwan and Liza outlined, you focus on that. Let the expertise be facilitated by those who are properly trained. Again, you want to be introspective and recognize what you are feeling. Your fear is very normal and very real, but which we have to be cognizant of is how our fear causes us to present, because my fear, and if I don't know how to hone that and check that, honestly, to be frank, will escalate this situation, causing threat to possible harm to others as well as the individual. A crisis in its most simplest form is when the individual is presenting with, and it presents as a threat to him or her or themselves or someone else. And that's really it in its simple. But again, that looks very different for someone with a depressive episode, who's depressed, versus someone who is living life navigating a diagnosis of schizophrenia. That looks very, very different, as well as, like I said, these other intersecting health issues. What I will say, I have had the opportunity because of my career that I've had to partner with MPD, and I use the word partnership because that's what it is. When I engage 911, the first thing I say before anything else, that this is a mental health or behavioral health crisis, or this individual is doing this due to, because the reason why I want to say that, when the officers show up on the scene, it is important that I have given them enough background, just enough to understand what they're walking into. Behavioral health is not a criminal offense. It's not against the law to have a behavioral health diagnosis or to be symptomatic. It's not against the law to be diabetic. It's not against the law to have an asthma attack. So neither is it when someone is experiencing a crisis. So my job is to partner with the experts when needed to help stabilize the situation. And so that is something I outlined at the beginning of my call. When they are on scene and I am there, once they arrive, I am there for some of our programs, and we have had to engage MPD or mobile supports on site to stabilize the environment. I'm meeting when I'm there and staff is trained, you meet them at the door. Again, I know what I said over the call, but when you get in the door, especially with the heat of what could be transpiring, I am reminding, wait a minute, this is a behavioral health crisis that is presenting, be it through whatever the behavior, how the behavior is presenting. And it is a partnership. Have I had to, in instances, remind some of the on-site emergency supports? Yes, that's my job. I think that partnership, that collaborative partnership involves me partnering. I am advocating on site in the moment for that client, regardless, if it requires where the person has to be escorted off premises, or there's a level of intervention requiring an involuntary hospitalization. Again, I don't stand in the way of that, but I am that participant, especially as staff member at Friendship Place, a client. I am advocating all the way, not just as they are escorted out of one of our facilities, but even while they are being hospitalized or stabilized, whatever that looks like. Force, individuals ask me about force. There have been instances where force is required. And when I say force, honestly, if you've ever engaged emergency services around behavioral health, they are especially depending upon the acuity of the presentation. The presentation of handcuffs, that can be triggering. That's a lot for the participant. That's a lot for you in the community. That is a lot for me as a trained professional. What I will say that the cuffs are not a representation of a criminal behavior. Honestly, the cuffs are represented as a mechanism that is requiring for the need for the safety and restraint. Now, there is a lot of dialogue about that. I understand that, and we all have mixed emotions around that. And that is why for those of us as bystanders, it is important that if you do engage 911, that you partner based on your own capacity with the first responders, and so that this is done in the most humane and safe manner as possible. But it's not pretty. Let me normalize that too. It is not pretty. It is not pretty to see someone in that level of distress. You are managing your own emotions at the same time. For some of us, we have personal connections to some of this. This can be very triggering, to say the least. And so I will say the aftermath of even engaging first responders, you don't be surprised if you're the one that has to do this, be it professionally or just as a neighbor, your need for your own self-care to kind of recenter yourself after this happens, because it can be it's going to trigger all your sensory. You're going to see, you'll possibly hear, you will feel. Please normalize the body, the physical reactions that you experience. Don't be surprised if you find yourself feeling some degree of crisis or trauma response. That, while uncomfortable, is very normal when we are talking about emergency supports for those experiencing a behavioral health crisis. Now, Chris, I know I have 5 minutes, so I'm gonna table it there.
No, Chandra, this was wonderful. And as you were speaking, there were just some key words that I was writing down because I think they're so powerful and so central to this conversation. One is partnership, right? We're all neighbors, we're all community members, whether we're housed or unhoused, or whether we're in crisis or not in crisis. And the fact that we have the opportunity to be in partnership with each other into helping all of us navigate difficult times, I think that's a very powerful message. And I think it was also very powerful what you mentioned, that oftentimes those whom we see on the street and those whom we fear are terrified of us and are terrified of their circumstance. And I think that's a powerful thing for us all to keep in mind as we go throughout. So thank you. And
Sure.
Sarah, I'm reading through the comments. Thank you for your wise and compassionate and compelling information from Sarah.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah.
I do want to go through some of the questions in the chat here, and let me see what we find here that looks like a more direct question. Several folks had asked about list of contacts and resources that we could point people to. So we've dropped in the chat first of all, the community resource team number. We've also dropped in the chat the shelter hotline. These are all very important numbers. Unfortunately, I can't seem to resend to that shelter hotline. If someone else could drop that in the chat, that would be helpful. But what other resources, and this really is open to anyone on the panel, can the layperson, someone who is not trained as a member of the DC Police Department's crisis intervention team, or not trained as someone such as a Friendship Place staff member, what can we do when we come across somebody who looks like they're just having a problem? What can we do on a day-to-day basis if we see somebody to help bring the situation down?
I would say there's a couple things and a couple ways to approach it. I'd say first, recognize what you may consider to be normal or helpful or correct or the safe way to live might not be for that person. So I would encourage people to put the shoe on the other foot. Doesn't mean you have to agree with the way someone's doing something. You just have to be receptive to what they're doing and realize that that might be their normal. And with that, I would say if you choose to engage with someone, do so at a space that gives them, both of you, the ability to not be up on each other. And I would lead with asking if they would like anything. Can I help you with something? I would encourage people not to give money. I would encourage food or supply or drink, just because, money can be used for things that it shouldn't be, and or folks could be robbed. So you don't necessarily want people to be victimized there, and they may actually get more use out of, sweatshirt, pair of socks, pair of shoes, a sandwich, what have you. That would be my advice there if you so choose that you would like to be a person to intervene. And I would also have people listen. And with that listening, just circling back, if someone tells you they're not interested, leave it alone. And if you think that they need something, then either call the mobile crisis team or call 911 and we'll come on out and we can take it further. But I would say just be respectful of people's space and be respectful of where people are mentally, and just understand that that might not be where you are and it might not be what you deem to be normal, helpful, or correct or safe, but that's where they are. So their present, their reality is going to be different than yours. And you don't have to change anybody's mind. And I would caution you to try not to do that. I would try to just listen. And sometimes people literally just want to vent, and that could be the most helpful thing.
No, that's
I would just say, if we can put in the chat just the list of the outreach teams throughout the city, because it depends on what area you in the city. It's a different support organization. So like if someone was experiencing homelessness or in a crisis in Tentley Town, of course you would reach out to myself or Liza, and we may already have a relationship with that individual. So we can better assist them because we really know their situation and already have rapport. So like if you're downtown, in the downtown area, maybe like the Pathways outreach team may already know that individual, may already have relationships with that individual. So it's always good to do a warm kind of handoff if you can.
No, and what was also very interesting, what Officer Wright had suggested about food and other items. I mean, that seems very much in line with what our street outreach teams provide for folks in need. I mean, so what tangible things, Antwan or Liza, do you provide for folks when you come across someone in need?
Food, hygiene products, most important things are like socks and kits, first aid kits, things like that. Water when it's really hot, maybe something warm when it's really cold, jackets, sweaters, things like that. Some of the stuff that the officers said, like those are things that we use to build rapport. Instead of money, we sometimes have like McDonald's gift cards and things like that, so folks can just go in, get something to eat, and it also gives them an opportunity to be able to sit inside for a while to get out of the heat or to get out of the cold. And it's good when they purchase a cup of coffee or something like that, that the store management is not like pushing them away because they have brought something.
That's helpful. And Chris Kennedy, our community engagement manager, I believe is on the call. Chris, if you can unmute yourself, great. If not, don't worry about it. But he, as part of what he does, is gather together from folks who offer to donate items, things exactly what Antwan just described, socks, toiletry items, first aid kits, and then we put together packets that then go out with street outreach folks to do what Antwan just said. There's a question in the chat I'm going to lead with here. So what, and this, we've covered this a little bit, but maybe it's worth a little more conversation. What constitutes a mental health crisis? Let's say someone is wandering around, maybe into the street, but not as having a clinical crisis. How do you define a mental health crisis for someone who's a layperson?
I'll jump in here. I think that is the complexity of all of this. And that's not just specific to a layperson, that's specific to those of us who may be trained and do the work. Because when we are working as a lay, I'll use the term you use, layperson, you don't know the baseline or the baseline presentation of the individual. This could very well be the normative behavior, while it may not be congruent to what we define as normal, or we may define it as odd. This may be the level of functioning for this individual. That does not, we don't get to put the label of crisis on that. And so I know this is hard. I wish I could give one concrete set definition, but this is why I keep using the word individualized. Like I said, if the person is presenting and it presents as threat of harm to themselves. So I'll use an example. We see this a lot, especially at our program at Valley Place and La Casa. Within that program, we serve individuals who have, in addition to many other health issues, behavioral health is a primary issue that we help support. At Friendship Place, we do not facilitate treatment. We support. And so some of that, it's not uncommon for some of our participants to are living with diagnoses of, I'll just use schizophrenia. And I've used that because that is a common diagnosis, one highly stigmatized. The behaviors, if you're not trained or accustomed to it, can be alarming for some individuals. And so with that, on a day-to-day basis, it is not uncommon to see these participants engaging in communication with themselves, or their reflection of what their reality is not congruent to mine. Schizophrenia presents with psychosis, hallucinations, delusional thinking, disorganized thoughts. It can present with speech, odd physical behaviors, things of that sort. That's not a crisis. If I did that, honestly, I would be engaging mobile crisis and Officer Wright and his team all day long. And so when we get onto the level when we're saying, okay, now it's time to partner with some external supports, we're looking at more of this individual, the behaviors, while they may quote unquote meet the definition of what I would define is normal. And while this person is, yes, engaging in a full conversation with someone that is not visible to me and things of that sort, what I'm looking more for is when the behavior has reached the level of this individual is doing things such as, and we see this, thrashing themselves up against buildings, physically aggressive at others. We do have individuals who have put themselves in front of traffic, not in the instance, not in with the desire to harm themselves. And that's another piece to it. Most often when you see crisis on depression, there's an intentional threat to harm themselves. When we're talking about psychosis, harm is not the goal. The goal is not, I'm putting myself up on harm's way because I want to be harmed. This is rooted in, like I said, whatever that individual's reality is. We had an incident where the individual became physically aggressive with the individual because they perceive staff as threatening. See, those are the things, and we're like, okay, this is at a crisis level. This is not something we can talk down because you can't speak to the person's reality. Remember, their reality when we're talking about this particular diagnosis is different. And so again, it's very individualized. It varies from person to person and diagnosis or presentation to presentation. But again, I think you can work to stabilize the environment. I love how Officer Wright set it up and not making assumptions. And what I think is correct. I think one of the things before we end it, I think we have to spend some time to, we're talking about intervention. We have to talk about our own personal biases regarding mental health. We all, regardless trained or not, have our own belief systems and what we define, how we define behavioral health. Now, this is rooted in experiences. This is rooted from things that we have seen and witnessed, stories, things of that account. But we have bias, and that bias is operationalized in our behavior. And what you think you are facilitating safety, you are saying in a safe manner. If you have unchecked biases regarding behavioral health, race, and other aspects of one's identity, that is going to show up in your determination of intervention. That is going to shade or jade your assessment as to, is this really a crisis? I'll say it. Is it a crisis? Is it really a crisis, or is it a crisis because of what you believe around mental health or what you believe around individuals of color who present with mental health issues? Those are questions we really have to ask ourselves when we're having these kind of conversations, because you're right, I will engage, and this happened more often than not, when I engage the external teams of support, MPD, mobile crisis, things of that sort. When you relay or present to them, because they will ask you how the individual is presenting, don't be surprised if they say that doesn't meet the standard of crisis. We're not coming out. I have had that happen quite a few instances. And so what happens is how I assess crisis, and again, this is me with my own background, as it relates to training. But some of that very well could have been in my own perception, it could have been my bias. Again, I'm not exempt from this critical dialogue and this level of introspection because I sit with the social work license. We all have it. And so I would admonish anybody before we get stuck in what do I do? What do I do? Let's take some time to really pause and think about, well, what do you believe about mental health? Because what you believe is what you will operationalize. And I think that's a critical aspect to this conversation.
I think that's so powerful, and that's so right that, again, and that was part of the description for this discussion was, is what you're seeing actually a mental health crisis, or is it just someone behaving in a manner that's not familiar to us? And you, as you properly pointed out, race is infused in that. And so I think that's always that taking a moment to analyze, is what I'm seeing something that rises to the level of, oh, I need to call 911, or is it something that someone is just behaving in a manner that is not familiar to me? And I think that's a powerful point. I'm going through some other questions here, unless any of the other panelists want to weigh in on that. Okay. What do we do when we come across someone who's asking for money at intersections? What Officer Wright, you offered some thoughts, but what is the compassionate thing to do when we come across somebody who is in need on the street? I'll let anyone weigh in there.
I would just say, do what you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable helping, great. If you can only give that person $1 at that moment, and that's something you're comfortable with, sure, do it. If they're standing in front of the Giant or in front of a 7-Eleven, maybe don't give them the $1, maybe get them the food in that situation. That's kind of, I'm not saying don't be helpful, don't be kind. Do what you can when you can, and guide your resources when you're able to.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to put him on the spot and call on him here, but when I first started at Friendship Place, I sat down with Alan Banks, who's still on the call here, and I asked, so what do you do when you come across somebody? And what was powerful for me, the first thing he said was, look this person in the eye and talk to them like a fellow human being, because so many people, thousands of people will walk by this person today and not acknowledge their humanity and the fact that we're all fellow human beings. And that is truly step one. So again, Alan, if you want to unmute and elaborate on that, if great, please don't feel you need to. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but it's just something that 5 years later has stuck with me, and I wanted to give proper credit to that.
Hey, good morning, Chris. Thank you for remembering stuff like that. That is something that comes from my experience, my lived experience, of having people ignore me. And the most important thing we need to remember is that someone who is experiencing homelessness is a human being. They experience homelessness, but that doesn't make them a bad person. You don't know who they are. And even if you choose not to give, remember you're speaking to a human being, and I don't have anything to give you today, or I choose not to give you anything, but you have a good day anyway. One of the worst days of my life was when a lady turned her back on me. I hadn't even asked her for anything, but I said good morning. She saw someone experiencing homelessness and she turned her back. And that was one of the worst days I ever had on the street.
Yeah, our conversation there stuck with me. So Alan, thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I appreciate you jumping in on that. Jess asks, says she works at a church and she has someone who's sleeping on their back porch, and they're fine with that, but they're also relieving themselves on sidewalks, which is a problem. Any thoughts on how to address that issue? People, using public spaces in that sort of way. I'm trying to dance around that, but I'll throw it to our panel now.
I would say that's could be a behavior health issue if they're defecating and things like that, but you would have to get somebody from DBH out to assess their situation. That could be another crisis situation where someone is neglecting their health or having some type of medical problem that they need to be treated for. But of course, we're not doctors or So we need the professionals to come out and assess the situation. Our outreach team can come out if it's in our area, in the in the Tinleytown area. But again, like, we would give them resources on where they can use the bathroom at. We would give them information to the nearest rec center, or, you know, we would make sure that they have, like, again, maybe a gift card or two so they can go into McDonald's and use the bathroom when they need to, or go into Starbucks when they need to. But again, like, those are some of the things that we can talk to folks about, give them resources, but like, we just can't make them stop.
So this is what I'm going to, wait a minute, we need to turn some mics down. So definitely, Antwan, I'm on the same page with you. But before we reach that juncture, perhaps, because remember at the Welcome Center, we would have people sleeping on the porch. So you know, we would tell them, unfortunately, you're not able to sleep on the porch. So before we get to the point where, you know, they're just out there and other things start happening, and I certainly understand the kindness of the community. You know, we're thinking, oh, we're going to help this person, but not realizing in helping that it some ways causes a larger problem. So now we're at this point where you say, okay, well, we've got to call in, you know, behavioral health services. So I would say just thank you to everyone, the community at large, everyone, for offering your back porch or the side of your house or whatever. But, you know, let's really think that through, or maybe reach out to Friendship Place or one of our partnering organizations before you make a decision to let someone camp on your back porch, because it definitely makes it a lot more difficult to eradicate the problem.
Okay. Chandra, your hand is up. Thank you, Joyce. Yeah.
So what I will add to that, for especially my community based organizations, my congregations and other businesses, there are homeless service providers that provide training and technical assistance. I think this is where you tap into some of that, what we call TA with some of these organizations, and that is what they're funded to do. It's because the reality is the needs and the services to support homeless individuals and families exceed our own individual capacity. We're talking about an epidemic here. And so with that, there are many organizations that are funded to provide ground level or community-based or grassroots efforts with the needed training and skills to support the unique needs of the homeless population. And so, for example, my congregations, when you're saying, yes, we give this level of accessibility in terms of a place to lay, fine. What you might want to do is tap into some of these organizations and get the needed TA. What does that look like? How do we provide equitable services on this level as a congregation, as a civic group, as a neighborhood HOA? What does this look like in our community on our level that we can facilitate this and address some of these things? There are strategies to this. Who do we need to partner with? There are systems and organizations in the community that will provide you with some resources to support. You're signed up for the individual to have capacity to lay there. That's fine. What you're saying is, okay, we can handle that part. We don't know what to do with this other part as it relates to hygiene and the related public health implications of someone not having proper access to bathing or to toiletries and things of that sort. Tap into those organizations. Training in TA is not only set aside for big organizations and federally or locally funded. No, it is designed for for our grassroots and community organizations, because we recognize that many of those organizations are the ones that's really on the ground. Those are the organizations and the individuals that really do that warm touching, while some of the other orgs are more on a macro level, facilitating policy and designing systems. But there are things and partners in the community that if you as a congregation or a ministry, you want to take your stand in the community to support the needs of homeless individuals and families safely, but you want to operate it within your capacity, tap into those resources. Those providers are around. And because what I would hate to see is the loss of that extension of service delivery. While of course I love what we do at Friendship Place and I stand behind it 100%, but while I also recognize there's a group on the ground that's beyond Friendship Place, and again, with kudos, we have a phenomenal outreach team, but I would never minimize of our community, our civic groups, our church ministries. They reach a level and touch at a place where I don't get to touch at in my role. And so my job is to make sure, because you don't necessarily have all that you need to support, that you then relinquish and just, what I would say, lead the movement in terms of addressing the needs of homeless individuals. And so that is a specific issue that is not unique. But what I will say is there are strategies that you can implement with the support of your community partners, other funders that outline, okay, we allow you to lay here or rest here, however you want to frame it. We've made a partnership with another business or something down the street where they have access to restrooms. They provide that, because there are providers and businesses that are doing that. Form those needed alliances and allyships so that we can increase the capacity beyond just Friendship Place, beyond your congregation, but throughout the entire city. And so tap into those resources.
Thank you. Thank you. Scrolling through some other questions here. One, putting aside crisis situations, what can we do when we see someone experiencing homelessness to connect them to the proper agency? I think the answer to that you'll find is the shelter. You give people access to the shelter hotline. Unfortunately, I'm not in a place right now where I could enter that phone number in. So if somebody could drop in the shelter hotline, that would be helpful. Also, there were some questions on when is the best time to call each of those, whether it be the crisis, the intervention officer, the shelter hotline, et cetera. And a request that we put this out on social media. So we shall do so. What we'll do after we're done on this call, Chandra, maybe if you and I and Sean, because I saw you put a lot of text in there, and Julianne, one of our communications folks who handles social media, and we will get together a email thread and put together some important updates for folks and say, if you see X, you can call Y, et cetera, and put that out on Twitter and Facebook here. Let's see, we have someone just writing here. We've been trying to get this person connected with the outreach team at Miriam's. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just reading through some other questions. In the past, we've had, yes, so we do have updated pocket guides. That's what Hal is referring to in his comment there in the text, with information to hand out to folks who are experiencing homelessness. And we actually have updated ones of those. We'll print some out and make them more, we've made some available at the Welcome Center, I think. If not, we can make them available, but we've actually updated the pocket guides as recently as about 3 months ago. So this is fairly up-to-date information that we'll be able to share. Thank you, Hal, very helpful as a reminder. And if folks want to email Chris Kennedy, C. Kennedy at Friendship Place, I think he'll be able to get you pocket guides, or email me and we can get you pocket guides as well. We do have a little bit more time if anyone wants to drop another question or two in the chat, or if you feel like I've not gotten to a question, I may have had to jump around things here. But I'll ask a question. No, thank you, Chris. Put your email in the chat there for you. What if we're hearing a crisis go on in one of the buildings in which we reside? It's something not on the street. What's the best approach to handle that?
Are you asking? I'm a resident in a building, and
yeah, exactly. I'm a resident in a building, and I hear a crisis unfolding with someone whom I believe has come through a program such as ours. What is the best approach to compassionately help the person in crisis?
I mean, again, I would, assessment is your 5 senses. What do you see, hear, smell, outside of taste? I don't think you're tasting anything. But if you have that rapport with your neighbor, that may be a strength that you can build upon, depending upon the circumstances. Now, I could have a great rapport with my neighbor, but if what I see or assess or hear lets me know that it's too alarming or beyond, that puts myself, I don't advocate anybody put themselves in harm's way. There's no value to that, and it's not necessary. But again, if you have that rapport and it's safe, I think you've heard many in the panel say that you can ask, what do you need? What can I do for you? Is there an area, is this a concern? How can I support you? Now there are instances where your neighbor may say, I'm fine, leave me alone, so on and so forth. But based on what there is imminent threat of harm to you, someone else, other residents in the building, then I think we have an ethical or moral obligation, and that may be hard language for some. We don't get to turn a blind eye. This is when we engage those necessary supports. But assess based, when I say assessment, I'm not saying it in the clinical context. I'm saying it, if it's my neighbor and I think he or she or they are in some degree of distress and we have that relationship, I'll ask. You may not, or at least we know each other, you can ask, but I would not base my response solely on their response in this instance where they're saying, no, I am fine. I think, I see Lacoste is here with me, Valley Place is here with me. I'm sure Welcome Center staff, often individuals will say, I'm fine. And this is not fine. This has the potential of being something much more detrimental or impactful. And then that is one of those things. And so it's a fine line from personal agency and autonomy and self-determination of a person versus then we cross this line into duty to warn or, involve other systems for safety. But, I personally, and others may chime in very differently, I would ask. I think we've heard that. There's no harm in asking. The harm is how you ask. That's the harm. You've heard Alan mention the lack of response was most traumatic or impactful. And thank you, Alan. I want to honor this space for your transparency in that moment. But the harm is not asking often or how you ask. There's a way to approach anxiously yet compassionately. And so I do understand that.
Well, I want to take one last question here, and I'm going to do this for Officer Wright, if you don't mind. The last question in the chat is, so if you see someone who appears to be in crisis and you call 911, is a crisis intervention officer automatically sent out? I guess, Officer Wright, how do you get someone the help they need without having it escalate unnecessarily? Is it best to call 911, best to call that crisis intervention line you had mentioned? So what are your words, sir?
I would say it's a very good question. I would say if you have a concern and you are uncomfortable for whatever reason in getting law enforcement involved, then you call Department of Behavioral Health to start out with. They may not have folks available. They have limited resources, and if they have a team, their team may be doing something else, or their teams may be doing something else. DC is a big place, and when things happen, it means the world to us in that moment, but there could be other things occurring too. So they just might not have a team available. So I say that to say you can give them a shout. Otherwise, when you call 911, you just make it clear that you want that it's a mental health call, and that you're requesting a CIO. And again, we also have limited resources. Our CIOs might be on another call at a given time. But with that happening, those calls are listened to by supervisors, whether it's a sergeant or a lieutenant or watch commander. And whether or not your CIO trained, a lot of our continuing education that we get every year as police officers, there are segments of that training that are specifically focused on mental health, and that's been occurring for years at this time. So even if you're not a CIO, you are at least at a bare minimum trained at a higher capacity than 20 years ago, for instance. And folks are responding in that way. I would say first of all, I would not call. If you think someone needs something, let someone else make that final determination if they do. If you don't feel comfortable chatting with them, then that's okay. You pay your taxes, whether that's the police department, whether it's nonprofits that get grants, utilize the resources that the city provides. I can tell you that, police officers here in the district, no one's interested in going hands-on with people unless we absolutely have to. Not to tangent, but our use of force statistics mirror that. And any officer that's going to be responding to these scenes has a body camera. So that should provide a level of comfort to anyone that's calling the police. And also, one thing I took some notes on, especially when Mr. Allen was chatting, that kind of resonated with me is, we're talking about homelessness and mental health and poverty and mental health. And I've been in this area coming up on 3 years. I worked in various other parts of the city over the last decade. And mental health is not unique to homelessness, and mental health is not unique to poverty. I respond weekly to houses that I will never, ever be able to live in. And folks are experiencing the same issues as someone who has a tent or a cardboard box. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that it's okay to be compassionate, and it's okay to let the resources that the city has put in place respond and help out as best that we can, or as best as they can. But I would say, you don't have to put yourself in that situation, and let the folks that have the patience and the experience in dealing with folks, let them come out there and give it a try.
That's very important. Thank you. Well, folks, we have we've gone over our time, and that's fine. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, particularly our panelists. So, Chandra, Liza, Antwan, Officer Wright, thank you all for being part of this. Alan, Joyce, you jumped in unexpectedly, so thanks for not minding us being called on every once in a while. This was very powerful, and I think a very meaningful conversation, and I hope folks took a lot away from it. And I think one of the things we did learn is, so we'll put together a couple of social media posts on if X then Y, that'll help more socialize some of the information we learned here today. I think that'll be powerful and useful. So we'll look for more to come on that front here. I'm just going to scroll very quickly to see if there's any critical, very nice thank yous. Lots of great thank yous. People love the panel, so I'll share that. I'll share that kudos. Jean-Michel, I'm going to turn it over to you very quickly, though. I'm going to drop in the chat if anyone is interested. Our gala is June the 16th. I'm going to cut and paste that, and maybe I'll let you. Yep, Jean-Michel, I want to thank everyone for being part of the work that we do here. I just dropped the link to the chat in the chat here. And you're a community that cares. We say that all the time, and I think that's very important to recognize. So again, thank you for joining us and wanting to learn more and being open to learn more. Jean-Michel, I will toss to you to close out.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and thank you to our panelists and everybody who added to the conversation today. I think this gives us a lot to build on. We've heard about compassion, kindness, checking the fear level on both sides, partnering with experts, thinking of where the crisis comes from. So many things that we can think about as friends and neighbors and people working in the neighborhood. So thank you all for being online again with us this afternoon. We're looking forward to having you at the next webinar in 3 weeks. We're going to talk about how people are selected for different programs that involve housing assistance in the district. So it should be a really interesting topic. Thank you to all the staff who made time to be online this afternoon, and to you, the donors, because we could never do this without you. Have a great rest of the day.